I just can't. It's too much. No, I saw the freezer when they were taking it out, and I was blocking out of my mind, hoping it wasn't that. And I don't know, I'm just in speechless.
A happy child full of life. Kayleigh Slusher was only 3 years old, but she had the kind of smile that could light up an entire room. Her tiny feet loved to tap dance in oversized shoes. She loved to play dress-up, spinning around in colorful outfits, her giggles filling the air. A bundle of joy with innocent eyes, Kayleigh loved puppies and would chase after them, her laughter ringing like music. Her favorite color was pink, and her room was filled with Disney princesses. Kayleigh was the picture of happiness. Her life full of simple joys, things every child should experience. But behind the bright, shining smile, something dark and sinister was slowly taking over her world. Kayleigh lived with her mother, Sarah Kruger, and Sarah's boyfriend, Ryan Warner, in a small apartment in Napa, California. At first glance, their home seemed normal, quiet, ordinary, but appearances can be deceiving. Sarah was a young mother, just 27 years old, and in the beginning, it looked like she was doing her best for Kayleigh. They spent their days together, going for walks, visiting relatives, playing in the courtyard. Kayleigh's world, though small, was full of love from her mom. But as much as Sarah loved her daughter, something else had a tighter grip on her past, her struggles, and her choices. Sarah had struggled with addiction in her younger years. Before Kayleigh was born, she had been involved with men who introduced her to drugs, and her relationship with Jason, Kayleigh's father, had been volatile. Jason's violent outbursts and prison sentences left a deep scar on Sarah's life. It wasn't long before Sarah met Ryan Warner, a man from her past. They began dating, and soon Ryan moved in with them. In the beginning, Ryan seemed like a good partner. He helped with Kayleigh, played with her, fed her, and even helped potty train her. But Ryan had a hidden side, a side that would slowly emerge and change everything for Kayleigh. He, too, struggled with addiction. Methamphetamine took hold of Sarah and Ryan. Their days began revolving around getting high, leaving Kayleigh isolated, often in her room or the living room, watching cartoons on her own. At first, the changes were subtle, just a shift in mood, a change in energy. But soon, things began to escalate. The apartment, once warm and welcoming, began to feel colder. Sarah and Ryan would lock themselves in their bedroom for hours, smoking meth, ignoring the outside world. Kayleigh's world, once filled with love and light, was now full of tension. The walls of their home absorbed the sounds of shouting, slamming doors, and violence. Neighbors began to hear loud arguments. The angry, bitter shouts between Sarah and Ryan often rang out late into the night. They heard furniture crashing to the ground. They heard Kayleigh's cries, but no one knew exactly what was happening behind those closed doors. Kayleigh's behavior began to change too. She had always been a bubbly, outgoing child, but over time, she became withdrawn. She stopped smiling as much. She stopped laughing. When she did, it was forced. She no longer ran to greet her mother with open arms, excited for her to come home. Instead, she seemed distant, sad. Kayleigh wasn't the same child anymore. Sarah and Ryan's relationship began to deteriorate even further. Their addiction fueled more than just their behavior. It fueled their violence. Sarah would try to escape the cycle of addiction, but it was never enough. The drugs continued to pull her back in, and when she tried to quit, Ryan would pull her down with him. Their fights became physical, pushing, hitting, even slamming doors. The tension in the apartment was palpable. Kayleigh, stuck in the middle of it all, became the silent witness to the chaos. In early 2013, Kayleigh's grandmother, Robin Slusher, began to notice changes in her granddaughter. She hadn't seen Kayleigh in months, and when she finally visited, Robin was shocked by how different the child had become. Kayleigh looked pale, withdrawn. Her face was bruised. There were signs of neglect. Robin could feel the fear in her granddaughter's eyes. But when Robin tried to intervene, Sarah made excuses. "Kayleigh's just sick," she'd say. "She's not feeling well. That's why she's acting like this." Despite the excuses, Robin's heart ached. She knew something was terribly wrong. She started making calls to Child Protective Services, the police. She told them about the bruises, the isolation, the neglect. She begged them to check on her granddaughter. But once again, no one listened. In December 2013, Sarah invited Ryan back into their lives after he had been gone for a while. He had been avoiding the law, and when he returned, his presence only made things worse. Sarah and Ryan began using meth every day, spending hours locked in their room, leaving Kayleigh alone. The apartment became even more disorganized, and Kayleigh's behavior worsened. As days turned to weeks, the signs of abuse were hard to ignore. Kayleigh, once full of energy, now had trouble sleeping. She cried more often. Her skin was pale. She stopped eating properly. Her energy drained away, and her once vibrant personality seemed to vanish. The environment of abuse, from innocence to fear, as Ryan became more entrenched in his own world of addiction. Something shifted in the apartment that was impossible to ignore. The walls, once filled with laughter, began to absorb a different sound, one of anger and tension. Sarah, too, fell deeper into the grip of methamphetamine, her behavior becoming erratic. She would forget to feed Kayleigh, or worse, would lash out at her for reasons no one could understand. The once happy little girl was starting to change, her energy drained. Her once bright eyes had become shadowed with confusion and fear. Where was the joy? Where was the innocent laughter that once defined her? Ryan's presence in their home no longer seemed like the kind protective figure he had initially presented himself as. Instead, he became another force of unpredictability, a ticking time bomb in an already volatile environment. Their relationship, already fragile, began to fracture under the weight of addiction. The arguments became more frequent. They'd shout at each other for hours, the tension building until it finally exploded. Ryan would break things, throw things, and more often than not, Sarah would get caught in the crossfire. The sounds of crashing furniture became regular, part of the routine. But it wasn't just the noise that changed the apartment. The atmosphere itself seemed to shift, becoming thick with hostility. Sarah, overwhelmed by the chaos, would retreat into her own world of substances, leaving Kayleigh to fend for herself. Kayleigh, once a lively, chatty child, grew quieter, more reserved. Her once sparkling personality dimmed. She seemed to shrink in size, both physically and emotionally. She no longer ran to greet her mother with excitement. When Sarah would come home after a long day, Kayleigh would look up at her, her face a mixture of fear and uncertainty. No one knew what was happening behind those walls. The neighbors started to notice, too. The constant arguments, the raised voices, the sounds of things breaking. They were worried. But like so many before them, they didn't know how to intervene. They couldn't bear to imagine what Kayleigh was enduring in silence. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the signs. One evening, as a loud argument echoed through the building, one neighbor, who had heard the terrible noise before, walked past the apartment door. Through the cracks, they saw something that chilled them to the bone. Kayleigh, sitting on the floor, her face bruised, her body weak and trembling. She didn't move, didn't play, didn't laugh. She sat there, like a broken doll. The neighbor immediately called the police. But despite their efforts, nothing changed. The authorities arrived, but they didn't see the bigger picture. Kayleigh's wounds were hidden beneath long sleeves, and Sarah's explanations, she fell. She'd been sick, seemed plausible enough to the officers at the time. But those explanations didn't explain Kayleigh's withdrawn demeanor or her constant fear. The police left, and once again, nothing was done. Despite the neighbors' calls, the visible signs of abuse, and the constant warnings, no one intervened. It was as if Kayleigh was invisible, her cries unheard. And so, the abuse continued. The apartment, which should have been her sanctuary, became a prison. Every room, every corner, filled with the shadows of fear. Kayleigh's once bright, colorful world was replaced by the darkness of neglect and violence. Each day brought a new form of torment, a new way to break her down. Her body became a canvas of bruises, some fading, some fresh. There was no escape, no one to save her. And as the days dragged on, Kayleigh's world of innocence became a memory, a distant dream she would never wake up from. The cry for help, warnings ignored. As the days passed, Robin Slusher, Kayleigh's grandmother, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had always been close to Kayleigh. She loved her granddaughter deeply and always made time to visit. But after Sarah and Ryan had become more involved with drugs, Robin noticed a disturbing shift in Kayleigh's behavior. When she visited, Kayleigh no longer ran to greet her. Her bright eyes no longer filled with excitement at the sight of her grandmother. Instead, Kayleigh seemed withdrawn, almost fearful. Robin's heart broke. The once happy, bubbly child she knew now appeared tired, pale, and far too quiet. There were bruises on her arms and legs, signs of neglect, and signs of abuse. When Robin asked Sarah about it, she was met with dismissive answers. "She's just clumsy," Sarah would say. "She fell off her bike." But Robin could see the truth. This wasn't just a few bumps and bruises from an active toddler. These were signs of something far worse. Robin's concern only deepened when she noticed Kayleigh's overall decline. The little girl was losing weight, her face becoming gaunt, her eyes hollow. Kayleigh wasn't playing anymore. She wasn't laughing. Instead, she was silent, curled up on the couch, or sitting in the corner of her room. One evening, Robin decided she couldn't ignore it anymore. She made a call to the Napa Police Department. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain the situation. "My granddaughter is in danger," she pleaded. "She has bruises on her body, and Sarah is addicted to drugs. Kayleigh's life is at risk. Please, you have to help her." The police assured her they would investigate, but nothing came of it. A few days later, Robin called Child Protective Services. She spoke to them about Kayleigh's condition, her withdrawal, her bruises, the dark circles under her eyes, and again, she begged them to intervene. But once again, nothing happened. Despite the clear signs of abuse, no one stepped in. Robin could feel her frustration growing, her helplessness consuming her. She wasn't just worried, she was terrified. She knew that if nothing was done, her precious granddaughter was in grave danger. Time passed, and the situation only grew worse. Robin's calls to the authorities continued, each time more urgent than the last. "Please, you don't understand. She's going to die if someone doesn't step in." Her voice was breaking, her words desperate. Still, no one listened. It seemed like everyone had failed Kayleigh. The neighbors had heard the arguments, seen the bruises. They, too, had made their own calls to the police and to Child Protective Services. But each time, the response was the same. Nothing. The system was failing this little girl. And Kayleigh, caught in the web of neglect and abuse, had no way to escape it. The fear and helplessness that filled Robin's heart grew each day. As she realized how alone Kayleigh was, the child had no voice. Her cries for help went unheard. No one could protect her. No one seemed willing to see the truth. And so, Kayleigh continued to suffer. Each day, her life grew darker. Each day, her mother and Ryan's addiction took deeper roots. Every night, she went to bed afraid, her body aching from the bruises and the hunger. Her world had become a prison, and there was no one to set her free. Kayleigh's death, from pain to silence. By the end of January 2014, Kayleigh's condition had deteriorated to the point of no return. She had become a shell of the joyful child she once was. No longer was she the girl who ran with excitement when she saw her mother or grandmother. Now, her eyes were empty, her small body had grown thin, and the bruises, old and new, covered her arms, legs, and face. Each day was more painful than the last, and with each passing moment, it became clearer that the system had failed her. Robin had been desperately trying to make contact with the authorities, but her calls had gone unanswered. Her worst fears were beginning to take shape. She knew Kayleigh was in danger, true, irreversible danger, but there was nothing more she could do. She was powerless. The last few days before Kayleigh's death were like a blur for Sarah and Ryan. The chaos in their lives, fueled by methamphetamine addiction, took over every aspect of their existence. They fought constantly, each argument more vicious than the last. But the small child, whose life should have been full of protection and comfort, was left alone to face the torment. On the morning of January 30th, Kayleigh was found in the bathroom, lying motionless on the cold floor. Sarah had been in a haze, consumed by her addiction. She hadn't noticed that her daughter was in grave distress. Kayleigh had been vomiting, probably from the toxic mixture of substances her body could no longer handle. She was limp, barely conscious. But Sarah failed to recognize the severity of the situation. Ryan was there, too. But instead of helping, he was consumed by his own addiction. His priorities twisted by the drugs that controlled him. When Sarah approached Kayleigh, her heart dropped. She had stopped breathing. She screamed for Ryan, but he didn't respond the way a parent should. He didn't rush to help, to call for an ambulance, to do anything. Instead, he grabbed Kayleigh's small, lifeless body. He shook her, hoping for some sign of life, but Kayleigh didn't move. Sarah screamed again. She begged Ryan to call for help, but Ryan, ever the manipulator, told her to wait. He needed time to think. He insisted there was no need for immediate help. Despite the obvious signs that something was horribly wrong, Kayleigh had already slipped away from the world. But Sarah and Ryan, in their drug-induced stupor, seemed to ignore the reality of it. They put her back in bed, wrapped her in blankets, and ignored the lifelessness of her small body. For days, Kayleigh's body lay in that bed, cold and still. Sarah and Ryan did nothing. They continued their routines, barely acknowledging the truth. They didn't call the police. They didn't make a move to get Kayleigh the help she needed. Instead, they kept her hidden, as if nothing had happened. The morning of February 1st marked the beginning of the end. A neighbor, who had witnessed some of the earlier abuse and seen the troubling signs of neglect, called the authorities one last time. This time, a sense of urgency hung in the air. There was a report of a strange odor, a possible danger. The police arrived at the apartment, their concern rising as they approached the door. This was it. The officers entered the apartment, which was eerily quiet. The smell was the first clue that something was wrong. They moved through the space, seeing the chaos, the disorder, and the neglected child's room. They pushed through the rooms, moving methodically but with growing dread. And then, they found her. Kayleigh's small, lifeless body was tucked under blankets. At first glance, they thought she was sleeping until they noticed the chilling truth. Her body was cold, unresponsive. No warmth, no life. The officers checked for a pulse. Nothing. Her small form, pale and bruised, looked almost unreal. This was the girl they had seen weeks ago. The girl who had once been full of life, now reduced to a lifeless shell. They quickly realized the extent of the tragedy. As the investigation unfolded, the details of Kayleigh's last days were revealed. She had suffered. Her body bore the marks of repeated abuse, 41 separate injuries, including bruises on her face, arms, legs, and torso. There were fractures in her ribs and signs of blunt force trauma. But the most horrifying revelation was the injury that led to her death. A ruptured section of her intestines caused by blunt force trauma. It had caused her internal organs to leak, and infection spread rapidly. Her death had been slow, agonizing, and avoidable. Kayleigh died from sepsis caused by untreated abdominal trauma. It was a death that no child should ever have to endure. And yet, she did. The discovery of Kayleigh's body marked the beginning of a long process for justice. The police began to piece together the chain of events leading to her death, interviewing neighbors, family members, and even Sarah and Ryan. They uncovered the full scope of the abuse Kayleigh had endured and the failures of those who should have protected her. Kayleigh's life, her suffering, and her death became a tragic symbol of everything that had gone wrong: failed systems, failed protection, and failed love. When the police arrived at the apartment, the horrific truth about Kayleigh's fate was finally undeniable. The scene they encountered was one of unimaginable pain and suffering. A small, fragile child who should have been surrounded by love and care, instead left in the most cruel and isolating of circumstances. Kayleigh's lifeless body spoke volumes, telling a story of torment and neglect. The discovery of her body was just the beginning of the long, painful road to justice. As investigators began piecing together the timeline of Kayleigh's life in those final months, they quickly learned how deep the dysfunction ran within her home. Sarah and Ryan had turned their apartment into a dark, chaotic place where addiction ruled and violence became part of their everyday lives. But the truth had been there all along. It was in the bruises that neighbors had seen on Kayleigh's body, in the arguments that echoed through the walls, and the reports Robin Slusher had made to the authorities, all of which had been ignored. The authorities had failed to protect her. They had failed to act on the numerous warning signs. This wasn't just a tragedy of neglect, it was a tragedy of systemic failure. For Robin Slusher, Kayleigh's death was a nightmare she could never wake up from. She had watched helplessly as her granddaughter suffered. She had seen the signs, made the calls, and still, no one had listened. She had known, deep down, that something terrible was happening to Kayleigh. But every time she reached out for help, she was met with indifference. Her desperation had been real. She pleaded with law enforcement and social services, but they didn't take her seriously. They didn't recognize the signs of abuse. They didn't see the urgency, the real danger that Kayleigh was living in. The hours, the days, the weeks, they all passed with no intervention, and ultimately, no one saved Kayleigh in time. When Sarah and Ryan were finally arrested, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. Both were charged with first-degree murder and the special circumstance of torture, a crime that seemed impossible to fathom, given Kayleigh's small, vulnerable body. The evidence against Sarah and Ryan was undeniable. Their addiction, their violence, their lack of care for Kayleigh, everything pointed to them being responsible for her death. The medical examiner's report revealed the full extent of Kayleigh's injuries. 41 separate marks of violence, bruises covering her body, including her face, arms, legs, and back. There were broken ribs, a wound on her spine, and blunt force trauma to her abdomen, which led to the ruptured intestines that caused her death. Kayleigh had been brutally beaten over an extended period, and the final blow, the trauma that led to her death, was not an accident. It was the culmination of weeks, months, perhaps years of abuse, all leading to this slow, agonizing death. But the question that lingered for the investigators and for everyone who loved Kayleigh was this: why had Sarah and Ryan done this? What drove them to harm an innocent child in such a horrific way? In the interviews with Sarah and Ryan, both tried to defend their actions, but their excuses were hollow. Sarah claimed that Ryan had been angry, that Kayleigh had misbehaved, but there was no justification for the level of violence that had been inflicted on her. Ryan insisted that he had not meant to kill Kayleigh, that the injuries were accidental, but his words were meaningless in the face of the overwhelming evidence. As the trial began, the full extent of the cruelty that had been carried out against Kayleigh became clearer. It wasn't just a matter of a single act of violence. This was a pattern of abuse, a calculated series of actions designed to break down a little girl, to torment her until she could no longer endure. The courtroom was filled with emotion as witnesses testified. Robin Slusher spoke through tears, recounting the many times she had called for help and been ignored. Neighbors spoke about the arguments they heard and the bruises they saw on Kayleigh's body, but none of them had known how bad it really was. None of them had been able to stop it. Kayleigh's life had been lost, and the criminal justice system would now have to reckon with the brutal reality of what had happened. The jury heard the evidence, saw the photos of Kayleigh's injuries, and listened to the testimonies. There was no escaping the fact that Sarah and Ryan had inflicted horrific pain on a defenseless child. In July 2017, after deliberating for weeks, the jury reached their verdict. Both Sarah and Ryan were found guilty of murder with special circumstances of torture. The judge sentenced them to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fitting consequence for the life they had stolen from Kayleigh. But even as justice was served, it didn't bring Kayleigh back. The hole left by her death was irreparable, and no sentence, no amount of compensation could make up for the life that had been taken so violently. Kayleigh was gone, but the legacy of her suffering would live on as a reminder of the dangers of neglect, of addiction, and of the systems that failed to protect her. It would be a call to action, a demand for change. In the aftermath of the trial, Robin and Kayleigh's father, Jason Slusher, filed a lawsuit against the Napa Police Department and Child Protective Services. They claimed that the authorities had failed to protect Kayleigh, despite the numerous warnings. The lawsuit was settled in 2019 for $5 million, a recognition that the system had failed Kayleigh in every possible way. But it couldn't bring her back. The world had lost Kayleigh Slusher, a beautiful, innocent child whose light was extinguished far too soon. Her smile, her laughter, the joy she once brought to everyone who knew her, all of it was gone. But in the wake of her death, something began to change. Kayleigh's story became a wake-up call, not just for those who knew her, but for the community and the systems that were supposed to protect her. Her tragic death exposed the cracks in the system, the failures of the authorities who were entrusted with keeping her safe. Her case sparked outrage. It ignited a fire within those who had seen the signs of abuse, those who had tried to help but were ignored. Kayleigh's life had been brutally stolen, but her death was not in vain. It was a catalyst for change, a rallying cry to fix what had gone so horribly wrong. In the months that followed the trial, the focus shifted from the pain of the loss to a commitment to ensure no other child would ever suffer the way Kayleigh had. Her story would not be forgotten, it would inspire action. Kayleigh's family, devastated by her loss, refused to let her death be forgotten. They fought to hold accountable not just the people who had killed her, but the systems that had failed her. Robin Slusher, Kayleigh's grandmother, worked tirelessly to raise awareness of the case. She pushed for change, hoping that by sharing Kayleigh's story, others would begin to see the gaps in child protective services, law enforcement, and social services. The lawsuit filed by Jason Slusher, Kayleigh's father, and Robin against the Napa Police Department and Child Protective Services was a turning point. It sought justice not just for the family, but for the countless other children who might be suffering in silence, unseen by a system that was meant to protect them. In 2019, the lawsuit was settled with a $5 million compensation, which was a clear acknowledgement that the agencies involved had failed to do their jobs. But no amount of money could ever bring Kayleigh back. The settlement wasn't the end, it was a symbol of the need for change. In Napa County, Kayleigh's death prompted a review of how Child Protective Services handled cases of suspected abuse. The case led to significant reforms, including new protocols for investigating child abuse claims and better communication between agencies. Social workers, law enforcement officers, and emergency responders underwent new training programs, learning how to spot the subtle signs of abuse and how to respond with the urgency it required. These changes, though born from Kayleigh's tragic story, aimed to prevent another child from falling through the cracks. There was a renewed commitment to ensuring that every child's cry for help would be heard. The legacy of Kayleigh's life became a catalyst for these much-needed reforms. Kayleigh's story also resonated beyond Napa County. National organizations focused on child advocacy and abuse prevention began using her story as a tool for raising awareness, Her death served as a reminder of the critical need for stronger child protection laws and a more responsive system that could act quickly in cases of suspected abuse. Her case was a tragic example of what can happen when warning signs are ignored, when systems fail to respond, and when people who are entrusted with protecting children are indifferent. But it also inspired change. It gave people a reason to care, to speak out when they saw something wrong, to advocate for children who were vulnerable, and to fight for a world where every child is safe from harm. Kayleigh's legacy wasn't just one of heartbreak, it became one of action. Communities all over began to question how they could do better, how they could protect the most vulnerable. Schools, child advocacy organizations, and community leaders rallied together to promote education about child abuse prevention, about recognizing the signs, and about taking action. Kayleigh became a symbol of why we must do better. Her story was shared, and people listened. They listened because no child should ever suffer the way she did. They listened because it could have been their child, their grandchild, their niece or nephew. And so, they took action. As we reflect on the heart-wrenching story of Kayleigh Slusher, we are left with an overwhelming sense of sorrow and disbelief. A life so young, so full of promise, cruelly stolen away. A beautiful child whose light should have shined brightly in the world, now silenced. Her laughter, her joy, her innocence all gone in an instant, swallowed by the darkness of neglect, abuse, and indifference. In the face of this tragedy, we pause to offer a prayer for Kayleigh's soul. A prayer for Kayleigh's soul. May Kayleigh find peace where there is no pain, no fear, no torment. May she be embraced by the light of love in a place where no child ever has to suffer. May her heart, broken by cruelty, be healed by the warmth of eternal comfort. May her spirit be surrounded by angels who will hold her gently, forever safe, forever loved. And though we cannot bring her back, may we carry her memory in our hearts and let it guide us toward kindness, toward compassion, toward justice for every child. Kayleigh, you were loved more than you will ever know. You will never be forgotten. Your story, your life, and your death will forever be a reminder of the fragility of childhood and the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. We honor your spirit, sweet angel, and we promise to do better in this world for you and for every child who deserves love, safety, and protection. A call to the community. Kayleigh's story, as painful as it is not just her story. It is the story of every child who suffers in silence. It is the story of the children who are abused and neglected, whose cries go unheard, whose pain is ignored. It is the story of a system that often fails those who need it the most. But it is also the story of the power we have as a community to change this reality. We cannot undo the pain that Kayleigh suffered, but we can honor her memory by waking up, by speaking out, and by protecting those who are most vulnerable. It is easy to turn away. It is easy to pretend that we don't see the signs. But the truth is, we must all do better. We must all become the voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. If you see a child who seems withdrawn, who has unexplained bruises, who is afraid to go home, speak up. If you hear something in your community, if you witness something that doesn't seem right, report it. You are not just a bystander. You are a protector, a guardian. The failure of the system cannot be an excuse. We must take action when we see a child in need. We must be vigilant. We must advocate for stronger laws, better training, and more resources to ensure that every child is safe from harm. Kayleigh's life, though tragically short, can serve as a spark, a catalyst for change. Let her story inspire us to do better, to care more, and to create a world where no child has to live in fear, where no child is forgotten. As we remember Kayleigh, we must carry the weight of her story with us, not as a burden, but as a call to action. Let us vow to stand up for the vulnerable, to be the voice that will not be silenced, and to do everything in our power to make sure no child suffers the way she did. Let this be Kayleigh's legacy, a reminder that we all share the responsibility to protect, to care, and to love. May her story awaken something within us, a desire to act, to make change, and to never turn a blind eye again. Rest in peace, little angel. We will never forget you.